Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, and allow your mind to drift into the marble columns and olive groves of ancient Greece. Imagine yourself walking through the bustling agora of ancient Athens, where the air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, olive oil, and something far more intoxicating. The Greeks, those pioneers of philosophy and democracy, were also masters of fermentation, creating beverages that could transport the mind to divine realms or plunge it into darkness. In this twilight hour, as you prepare for rest, we will wander through 4 distinct chapters of this intoxicating tale. First, we shall immerse ourselves in the daily rhythm of ordinary Greeks, discovering how dangerous drinks shaped their morning rituals, their work, and their dreams. If you want to help me to keep doing these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. It motivates and helps me keep bringing videos in this format. If you'd like to hear about a specific topic, leave a comment below, and I'll show you in the video when your topic is chosen. The sun rises slowly over the terracotta rooftops of a typical Greek household in the 5th century BCE, casting long shadows across the courtyard where clay amphitheaters stand like silent sentinels. You find yourself awakening in this ancient world where the first drink of the day might be your last. The morning air carries the scent of burning olive wood and something sharper, more acrid, the smell of fermentation gone wrong, of drinks that have turned from blessing to curse overnight. In this world, there are no health inspectors, no quality controls, no understanding of bacteria or chemical contamination. Imagine yourself as Cleomines, a potter living in the Keramikos district of Athens, where the clay vessels that hold life's most dangerous pleasures are born from earth and fire. Your calloused hands reach for the calyx beside your sleeping mat, a shallow drinking cup that has seen countless dawns. The liquid within appears innocent enough, a mixture of wine and water that the Greeks call kaikion. But this particular batch carries secrets that your ancestors never intended. The wine came from a vineyard where lead pipes channeled water through the pressing process, and the ceramic vessels used for fermentation were glazed with compounds that would horrify a modern chemist. The taste on your tongue is both familiar and strange, the expected tartness of diluted wine mixed with something metallic, something that makes your teeth ache slightly. You dismiss the sensation, as countless Greeks before you have done, attributing it to the natural bitterness of life itself. What you cannot know is that each sip introduces lead acetate into your bloodstream, a sweet poison the Romans would later call sugar of lead for its deceptively pleasant taste. The potters who crafted your cup, the vintners who processed your wine, the water carriers who filled the vessels, all unknowing participants in a daily ritual of slow poisoning. As you dress in your simple kaitan and prepare for another day at the pottery wheel, you notice that your neighbor, Lexios, moves with a characteristic shuffle of a man whose nervous system has been gradually compromised. His hands shake slightly as he reaches for his own morning drink, a mixture of wine, honey, and herbs that his wife prepares each dawn. What neither of them realizes is that the honey comes from bees that have fed on rhododendron nectar, creating what we now know as mad honey, a substance that can cause hallucinations, paralysis, and insufficient quantities, death. The streets of Athens begin to fill with the sounds of daily commerce. But if you listen carefully, you can hear undertones that speak of a population under siege by its own refreshments. There's Demetrios, the fishmonger. His voice carries the hoarse rasp of someone whose throat has been burned by improperly distilled spirits. His morning cup contains a mixture of wine and resin that has been contaminated during the distillation process, creating methanol alongside the intended ethanol. Each drink slowly destroys his optic nerves and liver, though he attributes his failing eyesight to the natural progression of age. Walking past the fountain where women gather to fill their water jugs, You observe the subtle signs of a society poisoning itself with every celebration, every religious ritual, every moment of attempted pleasure. The water itself, drawn from wells that seep through lead-rich soil or flow through the lead pipes that represent the height of engineering sophistication, carries its own burden of toxicity when mixed with wine for the daily ration that every Greek citizen expects. It becomes a cocktail of slow death disguised as the stuff of life itself. The young wife of Nicias, the blacksmith, approaches the fountain with an amphora balanced gracefully on her hip, but her movements carry a subtle tremor that speaks of neurological damage. Her daily cup contains wine that has been stored in vessels sealed with lead-based compounds, and the water she draws has flowed through the same lead pipes that supply the entire district. She is pregnant, though she does not yet know it, and the child growing within her will inherit the accumulated toxins of generations. Born into a world where the very act of quenching thirst is a gamble with death. As the morning progresses, and you make your way to the Agora, the central marketplace where all of Athens converges, you witness the broader patterns of this toxic culture. Merchants hawk their wares from stalls shaded by cloth awnings, and among their offerings are wines and spirits that represent the cutting edge of ancient technology in the depths of ancient ignorance. Here you can purchase wine that has been aged in amphorae lined with pitch and lead, creating a product that tastes divine but kills with mathematical precision. The merchant who sells it takes pride in his craft, unaware that he is dealing in liquid death. The philosophers gather in their usual corner of the Agora, their morning symposium already in progress despite the early hour. Socrates himself might be among them, raising a cup of wine mixed with water and honey, engaging in the very dialectical method that will outlive him by millennia, while simultaneously poisoning himself with heavy metals and natural toxins. The irony is lost on everyone present. These great minds, capable of questioning everything about existence and reality, never think to question the safety of what they drink. You pause at a stall where an old woman sells kaikion, the sacred drink associated with the Eleusinian mysteries. Her version is a mixture of barley, water, wine, and herbs that she gathers from the hillsides around Athens. What she cannot see are the ergot fungi that have contaminated some of the barley, creating a hallucinogenic compound that can cause convulsions, gangrene, and death. The mystical visions reported by initiates into the mysteries may well be the result of accidental poisoning. The touch of the divine confused with the kiss of death as you purchase a cup of her brew. The old woman's hands shake slightly, not from age, but from chronic exposure to the very substances she has spent decades preparing and consuming. Her eyes carry a distant look that might be wisdom, or might be the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose brain chemistry has been permanently altered by repeated exposure to natural psychoactive compounds. She speaks in riddles and metaphors that the young men interpret as profound insights, not recognizing them as the fragmented thoughts of a mind slowly dissolving under chemical assault. The morning air grows warmer as the sun climbs higher, and with the heat comes the stronger scent of fermentation from the countless vessels scattered throughout the city. Athens is essentially a vast brewery and distillery, with every household maintaining its own supply of alcoholic beverages and every merchant offering variations on the theme of fermented pleasure. The technology exists to create these drinks, but the knowledge to make them safely remains locked in the future, creating a city full of people who are slowly killing themselves in pursuit of the very experiences that make life worth living. Your day at the pottery wheel begins as countless days have begun before, with hands that are steady enough to shape clay but carry within their tissues the accumulated poison of years of supposedly safe drinking. The clay you work with contains its own dangers, lead compounds used to create glazes that will make the finished vessels more beautiful and more deadly. As you shape a new kylix, you are crafting not just a drinking cup, but a weapon that will wage war against its user's nervous system for years to come. The rhythm of your work is soothing, the wheels spinning beneath your hands as you transform earth into art. But even this peaceful activity carries its toxic burden. The dust from the clay contains silica that will slowly destroy your lungs, while the glazes you apply contain lead and other compounds that will seep through your skin and into your bloodstream. You are surrounded by beauty and danger in equal measure, living in a world where every pleasure comes with a price that is paid in flesh, in blood, and slow, inexorable deterioration. As the sun reaches its zenith over the marble temples of the Acropolis, the true danger of Greek drinking culture begins to reveal itself in the subtle patterns of daily life. You find yourself moving through the afternoon hours in ancient Athens, where the heat of the day drives citizens toward the shade of colonnades, in the supposed relief offered by cooled wine and herbal concoctions. The marble beneath your sandaled feet radiates warmth as you walk past the Stoa of Atalos, where merchants display their most prized beverages in the relative coolness of the covered walkway. Imagine yourself now as Theodoros, a middle-aged scribe who has spent the morning copying scrolls in the library of a lyceum. Your eyes ache from squinting at papyrus in the flickering light of oil lamps, and your hand cramps from gripping the reed stylus for hours on end. The afternoon break calls you away from your work toward the promise of refreshment. But in this world, refreshment and poison often share the same cup. You approach a tavern keeper named Lysander, whose establishment occupies a narrow building squeezed between a bronzesmith's workshop and a perfume merchant's stall. Lysander greets you with the practiced smile of a man who has built his fortune on humanity's need for liquid escape from the hardships of existence. His wine comes from various sources across the Greek world, some from the volcanic slopes of Santorini, others from the sun-baked hills of Crete, and still others from the mainland regions around Corinth and Thebes. What unites all these wines is not their quality or their flavor, but their shared burden of contamination that begins in the vineyard and compounds with every step of the production process. The amphora from which Lysander pours your afternoon refreshment bears the distinctive marking of a vineyard near Mount Vesuvius, where the volcanic soil imparts a distinctive mineral taste that Greeks prize highly. What they cannot know is that this same volcanic activity has enriched the soil with heavy metals that the grapevines absorb and concentrate in their fruit. Lead, mercury, and arsenic flow up from the roots through the stems and into the clusters of grapes that hang heavy and purple in the Mediterranean sun. Each vintage is a time capsule of geological poison, aged and concentrated into liquid form as Lysander mixes your wine with water from a bronze vessel that gleams in the afternoon light. You notice the characteristic green patina that marks the metal's age and use. This patina, which the Greeks consider a sign of quality and authenticity, is actually copper carbonate, a compound that leaches into any liquid that comes into contact with it. The water that dilutes your wine carries its own burden of copper toxicity, adding another layer to the chemical complexity that will course through your veins with each swallow. The tavern fills gradually with the afternoon crowd, artisans finishing their morning's work, merchants taking a break from haggling, soldiers on leave from their duties at the city walls. Each man carries with him the accumulated toxicity of his profession and his daily habits. The bronzesmith who sits at the next table shows the characteristic blue-green staining around his fingernails that speaks of chronic copper exposure, while his companion, a painter of ceramic vessels, displays the pale complexion and slight tremor that mark the slow progress of lead poisoning through his nervous system. You listen to their conversation as you sipped your wine, noting the slightly slurred speech that they attribute to the afternoon's drinking, but which actually reflects the neurological damage accumulated over years of exposure to heavy metals. They speak of their work with pride and passion, unaware that every masterpiece they create is slowly killing them. The bronzesmith describes a new technique for creating mirrors that involves mercury amalgamation, process that fills his workshop with vapors that attack his brain and kidneys with each breath. The painter enthusiasts about a new white pigment made from lead carbonate, T, that creates the most brilliant highlights on his vessels, never suspecting that the dust from this pigment is destroying his ability to think clearly and move with precision as the afternoon heat intensifies. Lysander offers you a special cooling drink that he claims will refresh both body and spirit. This concoction combines wine with water that has been cooled in a deep well, mixed with honey and herbs that his wife gathers from the hills outside Athens. The cooling process involves lowering bronze vessels into the well on ropes, where the metal's contact with mineral-rich water creates an even more concentrated solution of copper compounds. The honey, gathered from hives that feed on a mixture of wildflowers and cultivated plants, carries its own burden of natural toxins from flowers that produce alkaloids as protection against insects. The herbs that flavor this cooling drink represent a catalog of botanical Russian roulette. There is pennyroyal, valued for its refreshing scent, but carrying compounds that can cause liver failure in sufficient doses. Wild mint grows alongside plants from the nightshade family, K, and the gatherers who collect these herbs in the dim light of early morning sometimes make mistakes that prove fatal. Hemlock and water hemlock, both deadly members of the carrot family, can easily be confused with harmless herbs by those who lack detailed botanical Q. You accept Lysander's special drink with gratitude, feeling the immediate relief as the cool liquid soothes your parched throat. The taste is complex and pleasing. The sweetness of honey, the bite of wine, the refreshing coolness of well water, and the subtle herbal notes that seem to speak of mountain meadows and summer breezes. What you cannot taste are the copper compounds leaching from the cooling vessels, the lead accumulated in the honey from bees that feed on contaminated flowers, and the alkaloids from herbs that were misidentified during the morning's gathering expedition. As you drink, you notice that your vision seems slightly sharper, colors more vivid, thoughts more fluid. You attribute this to the refreshing nature of the drink and the pleasant company, never suspecting that you are experiencing the early stages of alkaloid intoxication. The herbs in your cup include small amounts of plants related to belladonna and datura, creating a mild hallucinogenic effect that the Greeks interpret as divine inspiration or the blessing of Dionysus upon their afternoon refreshment. The tavern's atmosphere grows more convivial as the afternoon progresses and more customers arrive seeking relief from the heat and the burdens of daily labor. A group of young men, probably students from the academy or the lyceum, engage in animated philosophical discussion while sharing a large mixing bowl of wine and water. Their conversation ranges across topics of logic, mathematics, and natural philosophy, but their reasoning becomes increasingly circular and confused as the afternoon wears on and they consume more of their contaminated refreshment. One of these young philosophers, a pale youth named Menander, who shows the telltale signs of chronic lead exposure, argues passionately about the nature of reality and the reliability of sensory experience. The irony is profound. His lead-damaged nervous system is systematically distorting his perception of reality, even as he constructs elaborate, logical arguments about the nature of truth and knowledge. His companions nod sagely at insights that are actually the confused ramblings of a poisoned mind, mistaking neurological damage for intellectual brilliance. At a table near the back of the tavern, a group of older men plays kotobo's, the drinking game that involves flicking wine dregs at targets while reclining on couches. This seemingly innocent entertainment actually represents another vector for lead exposure, as the wine dregs contain concentrated heavy metals that have settled out of solution during the drinking process. As the players flick these concentrated toxins around the room, they create an aerosol of poison that everyone in the tavern inhales with each breath. The afternoon light filters through the tavern's small windows, illuminating motes of dust that dance in the air like tiny spirits. But mixed with this dust are particles of lead, copper compounds, and other toxic substances that have been stirred up by the day's activities. The The bronzesmith's work has contributed metal filings that float on air currents, while the painter's activities have added pigment, particles that settle on surfaces and are constantly resuspended by movement and conversation. As you prepare to leave the tavern and return to your work, Lysander offers you a parting cup of what he calls traveling wine, a mixture designed to sustain energy and spirits during a journey. This concoction combines regular wine with additives that include ground minerals and herbs, creating a beverage that would horrify a modern toxicologist. The minerals include compounds of lead, mercury, and arsenic that ancient Greeks believe have medicinal properties, while the herbs include plants known to modern science as hepatotoxic and neurotoxic. You accept this final drink with thanks, feeling the immediate surge of energy and well-being that comes from the combination of alcohol, natural stimulants, and low-level poisoning that the ancient Greeks mistake for divine blessing. The taste is complex and invigorating, with metallic notes that you interpret as the flavor of strength and endurance. As you walk back through the agora toward your afternoon duties, you feel a slight numbness in your fingertips and a ringing in your ears that you dismiss as the natural result of a pleasant afternoon's drinking. The streets of Athens shimmer in the afternoon heat, and the marble columns of temples and public buildings seem to glow with an inner light that you attribute to the divine presence of the gods. What you are actually experiencing is a mild case of metal toxicity that affects your visual processing, creating the impression of enhanced beauty and spiritual significance in your surroundings. This phenomenon is so common among the population of Athens that it has become incorporated to religious and philosophical thought, with altered perception considered a sign of divine favor rather than neurological damage. As you settle back into your work copying scrolls, your hand moves with what seems like enhanced grace and precision across the papyrus. The words flow from your reed stylus with an ease that fills you with satisfaction and pride in your craftsmanship. What you cannot recognize is that the slight tremor in your hand, barely noticeable but steadily worsening, is not the natural result of age or fatigue, but the systematic destruction of your nervous system by the very drinks that make life in Athens bearable and beautiful. As the sun begins its descent toward the wind-dark sea, casting long shadows across the Athenian agora, the most dangerous hours of the Greek drinking day commence. You find yourself transitioning from the afternoon's work into the evening's rituals, where wine and water mix with traditions, religious observances, and social obligations to create a perfect storm of toxic consumption. The marble statues of gods and heroes seem to watch with stone eyes as their worshippers prepare to honor them with libations that will slowly claim more lives than any foreign army. Imagine yourself now as Celestians, a prosperous merchant who has spent the day negotiating contracts for olive oil and pottery. Your house sits on a hillside overlooking the city, its courtyard adorned with painted murals depicting scenes of Dionysiac celebration. As evening approaches, your household prepares for the daily ritual that marks the transition from work to rest, from the mundane concerns of commerce to the sacred obligations of hospitality and religious observance. Your wife, Penthesilea, moves gracefully through the courtyard, directing slaves in the preparation of the evening's libations and refreshments. The bronze mixing bowls, called craters, gleam in the fading light as they are positioned around the courtyard's central fountain. These vessels, crafted by the finest artisans in Athens, are works of art that will also serve as instruments of slow destruction. The bronze from which they are made contains impurities and alloying metals that leach into any liquid they contain, while their polished surfaces hide microscopic pores that harbor bacteria and other microorganisms that can turn wine into poison in a matter of hours under the wrong conditions. Your first guests begin to arrive as the sun touches the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that mirror the colors of the wine that will flow throughout the evening. These are men of substance and learning fellow merchants, retired soldiers, a philosopher from the academy, a physician who claims to understand the humoral theory of disease. Each brings with him not only his conversation and companionship, but also his own accumulated burden of toxic exposure from years of participating in Athens' sophisticated drinking culture. The evening's libations begin with the traditional offering to the gods, a mixture of wine, honey, and olive oil poured onto the ground as acknowledgement of divine favor and protection. This ritual, performed countless times throughout the Greek world, represents one of the safer uses of these dangerous beverages. At least the toxins go into the earth rather than into human bodies. But even this sacred act carries its own risks, as the sweet scent of the libation attracts insects and other creatures that may carry diseases, and the sticky residue provides a breeding ground for microorganisms that will later contaminate other drinks prepared in the same area. As the formal drinking begins, your wife's slaves move efficiently through the gathering, filling cups from the great craters and ensuring that no guest vessel remains empty for more than a few moments. The wine they serve has been mixed according to ancient tradition, 3 parts water to 1 part wine for ordinary consumption, though stronger mixtures are available for those who seek more intense experiences. What none of them realize is that this dilution process, intended to prevent drunkenness and promote rational conversation, actually increases the surface area of liquid exposed to the contaminated vessels, accelerating the leaching of toxic compounds into the drink. The water used for dilution comes from the household's private well, a source of pride for a prosperous family like yours. This well draws from an underground stream that flows beneath the city, picking up minerals and compounds from the soil and rock through which it passes, lead from ancient mining operations, mercury from naturally occurring deposits, and arsenic from geological formations. All contribute to the complex chemistry of what the Greeks considered the purest and safest water available. The well's depth and the clarity of its water are taken as signs of quality, never suspecting that depth only means more opportunity for contamination. From deep geological sources, the conversation flows as smoothly as the wine, ranging across topics of politics, philosophy, art, and commerce. Your guest, Xenophanes, the philosopher, speaks eloquently about the nature of knowledge and the reliability of sensory experience. His words slightly slurred, not from intoxication, but from the neurological effects of chronic lead exposure. His insights are profound, and his logic seemingly flawless. But if you could examine his brain tissue, you would find it riddled with the characteristic lesions of heavy metal poisoning. The very thoughts that make him renowned for wisdom are being generated by a nervous system under constant chemical assault. Nikia, the physician among your guests, offers learned commentary on the healthful properties of wine when properly mixed with water and consumed in moderation. He explains the theory of humors and how different wines can correct imbalances in the body's natural fluids, never suspecting that his medical knowledge, extensive though it may be, lacks any understanding of the toxic compounds that are the true active ingredients in many of his prescribed treatments. His own pale complexion and slight hand tremor reflect years of tasting medicines and treatments that contain lethal doses of mercury, lead, and arsenic. As the evening progresses and more wine is consumed, the gathering takes on the characteristic atmosphere of a successful symposium, animated discussion, displays of wit and learning, the recitation of poetry, and the gradual loosening of social inhibitions. What appears to be the natural result of wine's liberating effects is actually a complex neurochemical process involving not just ethanol, but dozens of toxic compounds that affects brain function in unpredictable ways. The lead in the wine suppresses inhibitions by damaging the frontal cortex, while copper compounds create mood changes that the Greeks interpret as divine inspiration. The cups themselves, crafted by master potters like the Cleomines you embodied this morning, represent miniature masterpieces of ceramic art. Their black figure and red figure decorations depict scenes from mythology and daily life with exquisite skill and artistry. But the glazes that create these beautiful images contain lead compounds in concentrations that would be considered hazardous waste by modern standards. Each time a cup is filled and emptied, minute amounts of these glazes dissolve into the wine, creating a steady stream of neurotoxic compounds that accumulate in the drinker's tissues over time. Your wife, Penthesilea, following the customs that exclude respectable women from men's drinking parties, observes the gathering from the shadows of the colonnade that surrounds the courtyard. She sips occasionally from her own cup, a delicate vessel decorated with images of Artemis hunting in moonlit forests. Her wine is mixed with honey and herbs that are supposed to promote health and fertility. But the honey comes from bees that feeds on oleander and other toxic plants, while the herbs include plants from the mint family that have been contaminated with more dangerous species during harvesting. The drink that is meant to ensure her well-being is slowly destroying her liver and nervous system with each carefully measured sip. The slaves, who serve the gathering, face even greater risks, as they must constantly handle the contaminated vessels and breathe the vapors that rise from the mixing bowls. Their lower social status means they receive inferior food and medical care, making them more susceptible to the toxic effects of the compounds they encounter daily. The young slave boy who fills your cup shows its characteristic growth, retardation, and developmental delays that result from chronic lead exposure. Though these symptoms are attributed to his foreign birth and inferior breeding rather than to environmental poisoning, as full darkness settles over Athens, torches are lit around the courtyard, or flickering flames creating dancing shadows that seem to bring the painted figures on the walls to life. The light reflects off the polished bronze of the mixing vessels and the glazed surfaces of the drinking cups, creating an atmosphere of magical beauty that enchants everyone present. This beauty, like so much in Greek culture, comes at a hidden cost. The torches burn olive oil that has been stored in lined containers, releasing vapors that add yet another source of toxicity to the evening's chemical cocktail. The philosophical discussions grow more abstract and mystical as the night progresses, with guests exploring concepts of reality, consciousness, and divine inspiration that seem to flow naturally from their wine-enhanced insights. What they are actually experiencing is a form of mild hallucinogenic intoxication caused by the combination of alcohol, heavy metals, and plant alkaloids in their drinks. The profound thoughts and spiritual experiences they attribute to wine's ability to reveal truth are actually the confused perceptions of brains under chemical assault. Let us now turn our attention to the biography of a man whose life exemplifies the dangerous relationship between ancient Greeks and their most treasured beverages. Mnesikles of Aegina was born in the 3rd year of the 78th Olympiad, when the island of Aegina still maintained its independence and its reputation as a center of commerce and craftsmanship. His story unfolds like a tragedy by Sophocles, with wine playing the role of both chorus and antagonist, commenting on the action while simultaneously driving it toward its inevitable conclusion. Picture young Mnesikles in the harbor town of Aegina, where the scent of salt spray mingles with the aroma of fermenting grapes from the terraced vineyards. Tak climbed the slopes of the island's central mountain. His father, Klindros, operated one of the most successful wine trading businesses in the Aegean, his connections stretching from the Crimean colonies to the markets of Alexandria. The family's prosperity was built on their ability to identify, transport, and blend wines from across the Mediterranean world, creating unique mixtures that commanded premium prices from discerning customers. From his earliest childhood, Mnesikles was immersed in a world where wine was not merely a beverage, but a complex matrix of flavors, aromas, and properties that could be combined and manipulated to create experiences ranging from simple refreshment to profound mystical revelation. His father taught him to distinguish between wines produced on volcanic soils and those grown in limestone regions, to recognize the difference between grapes pressed immediately and those allowed to begin fermentation on the vine, to identify the subtle variations that resulted from different storage methods and aging processes. What neither father nor son understood were the chemical mechanisms underlying these sensory differences. The volcanic wines they prized for their distinctive flavor derived their character partly from the high concentrations of heavy metals absorbed by the vines from mineral-rich soil. The limestone region wines, valued for their clarity and keeping qualities, contained calcium compounds that interacted with other chemicals during fermentation to create new toxic substances. The aging processes they had perfected over generations were actually complex chemical reactions that concentrated some harmful compounds while creating others entirely by the age of 15. Mnesikles had developed what his family considered an extraordinary palate, capable of detecting subtle nuances in wine that escaped less gifted tasters. What they celebrated as exceptional sensitivity was actually the early manifestation of heavy metal poisoning affecting his nervous system. Lead and mercury accumulating in his brain tissue were altering his sensory processing in ways that allowed him to perceive flavors and aromas that were literally invisible to healthier individuals. His gift was actually a symptom of systematic poisoning that would eventually destroy him. As Mnesikles matured and began to take an active role in the family business, he showed an innovative spirit that led him to experiment with new blending techniques and exotic additives. He traveled throughout the Greek world, visiting vineyards and wine markets from the colonies of Magna Graecia to the ancient vintages of the Aegean Islands. Each journey exposed him to new varieties of contamination and new methods of inadvertent poisoning. As local winemakers shared their traditional techniques without understanding the toxic chemistry they were manipulating. In Syracuse, Mnesikles learned to create wines that sparkled and foamed when poured, achieved through a secondary fermentation process that trapped carbon dioxide in the liquid. This technique, which would be rediscovered and refined centuries later as the Untitled Chapter, created not only the desired effervescence, but also higher concentrations of organic acids and aldehydes that attacked the liver and nervous system with particular effectiveness. The sparkling wines he brought back to Aegina became legendary for their ability to induce prophetic visions and mystical experiences, effects that were actually symptoms of mild poisoning from the concentrated fermentation byproducts during his travels. In the Black Sea region, Mnesikles encountered winemakers who added honey from specific regions known for producing honey with unusual properties. This honey, gathered from bees that fed on rhododendron and azalea flowers, contained granulotoxins that could cause hallucinations, temporary paralysis, and insufficient doses, death. The local vintners had learned through bitter experience to use only small amounts of this mad honey, but they had never understood why some batches were safe while others proved lethal. Mnesikles, lacking this hard-won local knowledge, brought back techniques that would prove far more dangerous when applied to different varieties of honey and wine. The turning point in Mnesikles' career came when he was commissioned to create a special vintage for the celebration of Aegina's victory over a Corinthian trading fleet. This wine was to be the centerpiece of a festival that would demonstrate Aegina's prosperity and sophistication to delegates from across the Greek world. Mnesikles threw himself into the project with the passion of an artist creating his masterpiece, combining wines from 7 different regions with additives that included honey, herbs, spices, and mineral compounds that he believed would create a drink worthy of the gods themselves. The creation of this celebration wine became an obsession that consumed months of Mnesikles' life. He tasted countless combinations, adjusting proportions with the precision of a pharmacist preparing medicine, never realizing that he was actually compounding poison with the same meticulous care. Each tasting session exposed him to higher concentrations of toxic compounds as he refined his formula through direct sensory experience. His assistants, watching his dedication with admiration, began to notice subtle changes in his behavior and appearance that they attributed to the intense concentration required by his work. the honey component of Mnesikles' masterpiece wine came from apiaries scattered across the Aegean, contributing its own unique flavor profile and its own particular burden of natural toxins. Honey from Crete brought the concentrated sweetness of thyme and wildflowers, along with alkaloids from plants that the bees had visited. Samples from the mountains of Arcadia contributed the taste of pine and herb honey contaminated with compounds from poisonous plants that grew alongside the nectar sources. The final blend contained dozens of different toxic substances and concentrations that no single source would have provided. The herbal components represented an even more dangerous gamble with botanical Russian roulette. Mnesikles gathered plants during pre-dawn expeditions to hillsides and meadows around Aegina, identifying species by moonlight and the uncertain illumination of oil lamps. His knowledge of botany, extensive though it was, relied on traditional lore passed down through generations of winemakers rather than systematic scientific understanding. He confused harmless species with their toxic relatives, gathered plants at the wrong stage of their growth cycle when alkaloid concentrations were highest, and mixed species that created dangerous interactions when combined. Among the herbs he incorporated were plants from the nightshade family, valued for their supposed ability to induce prophetic dreams but carrying tropane alkaloids that could cause delirium, coma, and death. Wild parsley grew alongside poison hemlock in the meadows where he gathered, and in the dim light of early morning, the similarity between the two plants led to tragic mistakes. Plants related to the ergot fungus, growing on wild grasses, contributed hallucinogenic compounds that would produce the mystical experiences he sought to create, but also carried the risk of gangrene convulsions and fatal poisoning. The mineral components of Mnesikles' special wine reflected the ancient Greek belief that various stones and metals possessed medicinal and spiritual properties. He added carefully measured amounts of cinnabar for its beautiful red color, not knowing that this mercury sulfide compound would release toxic mercury vapors as the wine aged. Powdered lead was incorporated for its sweet taste and supposed ability to preserve wine, while antimony compounds were included for their metallic luster and presumed magical properties. Each mineral addition was based on centuries of tradition and empirical observation, but none was guided by any understanding of the deadly chemistry being unleashed as the festival date approached. Mnesikles began to experience what he interpreted as divine inspiration and prophetic insight. His sleep was filled with vivid dreams that seemed to reveal hidden truths about wine, life, and the nature of reality itself. He attributed these experiences to the blessing of Dionysus upon his work, never suspecting that they were actually symptoms of chronic poisoning from his constant exposure to the toxic compounds he was blending. The clarity of thought and enhanced sensory perception he experienced were classic signs of heavy metal poisoning affecting his brain function. The festival wine was finally ready. 3 days before the celebration was scheduled to begin, Mnesikles oversaw its transfer from the mixing vessels where it had been prepared to the ornate amphorae that would be used for serving. These vessels, crafted by the finest potters on Aegina, were decorated with scenes depicting Dionysus and his followers in various stages of ecstatic celebration. The glazes used to create these decorations contained lead, compounds in such high concentrations that they would continue leaching toxic material into the wine even as it was being consumed. The first taste of the finished wine produced what Mnesikles considered confirmation of his success. The flavor was complex beyond anything he had previously achieved, with layers of taste and aroma that seemed to unfold in waves across the palate. The immediate effect was a sense of euphoria and clarity that he interpreted as the wine's ability to bring mortals closer to the divine realm. What he was actually experiencing was acute intoxication from the combination of alcohol, heavy metals, plant alkaloids, and organic compounds that his months of experimentation had concentrated into liquid form. The months following the festival saw Mnesikles at the height of his career, in the beginning of his decline. Orders for his wine came from across the Mediterranean world, and he established workshops on several islands to meet the demand for his unique blends. Each workshop required him to train local assistants in his techniques, spreading both his knowledge and the toxic practices it entailed. He traveled constantly, supervising production, gathering new ingredients, and experimenting with variations on his successful formulas. During this period of expansion, Mnesikles began to develop what appeared to be an almost supernatural ability to predict which wine blends would be successful and which would fail. His assistants watched in amazement as he would taste a mixture once and immediately know whether it needed more honey, different herbs, or additional aging. What they were witnessing was not supernatural insight, but the progressive destruction of his nervous system, which was creating synesthesia and other perceptual abnormalities that allowed him to process sensory information in entirely new ways. The first serious symptom that Mnesikles could not ignore appeared during the second year. After his triumph at the festival, he began to experience episodes of what seemed like divine possession, periods lasting several hours during which he would speak in strange voices, prophesy future events, and demonstrate knowledge that he claimed came directly from the gods. These episodes, which occurred with increasing frequency, were actually seizures caused by the accumulation of neurotoxic compounds in his brain tissue. As his condition worsened, Mnesikles' behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. He would spend entire nights wandering through his vineyards, talking to the vines as if they were old friends who could offer advice about blending and fermentation. His assistants began to whisper that he had been granted special favor by Dionysus, never suspecting that they were watching the systematic destruction of a brilliant mind by the very substances that had made him famous. The final phase of Mnesikles' life unfolded with the inexorable logic of Greek tragedy. His winemaking became increasingly experimental and dangerous as his poisoned brain generated ideas that seemed brilliant but were actually the product of damaged neural pathways, creating false connections between unrelated concepts. He began incorporating materials that no sane person would consider adding to wine: minerals scraped from cave walls, water collected during solar eclipses, herbs gathered only during thunderstorms when their supposed magical properties would be enhanced by the electrical activity in the atmosphere. The transformation of Mnesikles from celebrated craftsman to cautionary tale accelerated during the third year. Following his triumphant festival wine, his workshops, once models of precision and quality control, began producing batches of wine that varied wildly in both potency and safety. Some lots were so heavily contaminated with toxic compounds that they caused immediate illness in anyone who consumed them, while others seemed harmless until their delayed effects manifested weeks or months later in the form of neurological damage, organ failure, and mysterious wasting diseases. The island of Aegina itself began to show the cumulative effects of housing Mnesikles' expanding wine empire. The terraced vineyards that had once been a source of pride for the island's inhabitants were now contaminated with runoff from his experimental processes. Heavy metals leached into the groundwater from the vast quantities of mercury, lead, and arsenic compounds he used in his increasingly bizarre formulations. The herbs he gathered with such intensity were becoming scarce as he stripped entire hillsides of plant life, often taking species faster than they could regenerate and disrupting the ecological balance that had sustained the island's agriculture for centuries. Imagine yourself now as Theogenes, one of Mnesikles' most trusted assistants, watching with growing concern as your master's brilliant mind slowly disintegrates under the chemical assault of his own creations. You've worked alongside him for 5 years, learning techniques and secrets that no other winemaker in the Mediterranean possesses. But you are beginning to recognize that this knowledge comes at a price that may be too high for any mortal to pay. Your own hands show the telltale staining of metal poisoning. and your sleep is disturbed by dreams that seem too vivid and strange to be entirely natural. The workshop, where you spend your days, has become a laboratory of inadvertent toxicology, its surfaces saturated with compounds that would horrify a modern chemist. The bronze vessels used for mixing have developed a patina that goes far beyond normal oxidation, creating a rainbow of colors that reflects the complex chemical reactions taking place between metals and the exotic substances. Mnesikles continues to add to its formulations. The wooden surfaces of tables and shelves are stained with residues from dozens of different toxic preparations, creating a toxic environment that affects everyone who works in the space. You watch as Mnesikles examines a new shipment of cinnabar from the mines of Spain, the brilliant red crystals that will contribute their mercury content to his latest experimental vintage. His hands, once steady and precise, shake slightly as he measures the mineral powder, and you notice that his fingernails have taken on a blue-gray tinge that speaks of chronic metal exposure. When he speaks, his words sometimes slur together in ways that suggest neurological impairment, though he attributes this to fatigue and the natural effects of aging. The process of creating what Mnesikles calls his perfected wine has become an elaborate ritual that combines winemaking with alchemy, chemistry, and what can only be described as slow-motion suicide. He begins each batch with wine selected from specific vineyards during particular phases of the moon, believing that lunar influences affect the chemical properties of the grape juice. These past wines, already contaminated with heavy metals from their volcanic or mineral-rich soils, serve as the foundation for increasingly complex additions. The first stage of enhancement involves what Mnesikles terms celestial water, rainwater collected during thunderstorms and stored in vessels made from a specific type of clay found only in caves on Mount Olympus. This clay, rich in naturally occurring radioactive minerals, slowly dissolves into the water over the months of storage, creating a radioactive solution that Mnesikles believes carries the essence of divine power. Modern science would recognize this as a deadly cocktail of radium, uranium, and other radioactive elements that attack DNA and cause cancer. But to the ancient Greek mind, the faint luminescence visible in complete darkness proves the water's divine origin. The herbal components of the perfected wine represent a catalog of botanical toxicology that spans the entire Mediterranean world. Mnesikles has established a network of gatherers who scoured remote mountains and isolated islands for plants with unusual properties, bringing back specimens that range from the merely poisonous to the absolutely lethal. His collection includes roots of plants related to wolfsbane, gathered from alpine meadows, where they concentrate alkaloids as protection against the harsh mountain climate. Seeds from trees in the yew family contribute taxine compounds that affect the heart and nervous system in ways that ancient Greeks interpret as spiritual transformation. Perhaps most dangerous of all are the fungal additions that Mnesikles has begun incorporating after observing their effects on grain and other agricultural products. Ergot fungi, scraped from infected rye and barley, provide the hallucinogenic compounds that create mystical visions, but also cause gangrene, convulsions, and death. Various molds and yeasts, cultivated in conditions that would be considered unsanitary by any modern standard, contribute enzymes and toxins that transform the wine's chemistry in unpredictable ways. Each batch of perfected wine becomes a unique experiment in biochemical warfare against the human nervous system. The customers who continue to seek out Mnesikles wines form a select group of wealthy connoisseurs and spiritual seekers who are willing to pay enormous sums for beverages that promise transcendent experiences. These patrons, scattered across the Greek world, include philosophers seeking direct contact with divine wisdom, artists hoping to enhance their creative inspiration, and religious initiates looking for shortcuts to mystical revelation. What unites them is their willingness to risk their health, and sanity in pursuit of experiences that they believe will elevate them above ordinary human consciousness. The correspondence that arrives at the workshop tells a story of gradual destruction disguised as spiritual achievement. Letters from Athens describe symposiums where Mnesikles wine has produced visions of such intensity that participants believe they have spoken directly with the gods, never suspecting that they are experiencing hallucinations caused by systematic poisoning. Reports from Corinth tell of artists whose work has achieved new levels of brilliance and originality after consuming the perfected wine, though reading between the lines reveals descriptions of behavior that suggests severe neurological impairment. One regular customer, a wealthy merchant named Aristodemus, who has built his fortune on trade with the Black Sea colonies, writes to describe the profound spiritual insights he has gained through regular consumption of Mnesikles' most potent creations. His letters, initially coherent and businesslike, gradually deteriorate into rambling, mystical discourse filled with grandiose claims about his ability to predict the future and communicate with deceased relatives. The handwriting itself tells a story of progressive neurological damage, starting with neat, controlled script and degenerating into shaky, barely legible scrawls that reflect the destruction of fine motor control. The most disturbing correspondence comes from the widow of Cleomenes, a Spartan warrior who had commissioned a special vintage to share with his fellow soldiers before an important battle. Her letter, written in the careful script of someone unaccustomed to handling a stylus, describes how her husband and his companions experienced what they interpreted as divine favor and supernatural courage after consuming Mnesikles wine. The battle was won, but the victory came at an unexpected cost within a month of their return. All the warriors who had shared the special wine began experiencing seizures, paralysis, and other symptoms that no physician could explain or treat. By the time the widow wrote her letter, her husband and most of his companions were dead, their bodies discovered to be filled with the characteristic lesions of heavy metal poisoning. As word of these tragedies begins to spread, Mnesikles' reputation starts to shift from that of a master craftsman to something more ominous. Whispers circulate in wine markets across the Aegean about the dangerous effects of his products. But these warnings are often dismissed as jealousy from competitors or ignorance from those who lack the sophistication to appreciate truly transcendent beverages. The very toxicity that is killing his customers is interpreted by many as proof of the wine's power and authenticity. After all, anything capable of producing such profound effects must surely contain divine essence. The psychological effects of chronic poisoning began to manifest in Mnesikles as a messianic complex that convinces him he has been chosen by Dionysus to revolutionize human consciousness through the medium of wine. His conversations become increasingly dominated by grandiose claims about his mission to elevate humanity to a higher plane of existence. Even as his physical condition continues to deteriorate, the tremor in his hands spreads to affect his entire body. His vision becomes unreliable and filled with hallucinations that he interprets as divine visions, and his speech patterns reflect the fragmented thinking characteristic of advanced heavy metal poisoning. You find yourself in the increasingly difficult position of trying to continue normal wine production while accommodating your master's ever more dangerous experiments. The regular commercial wines that provide the workshop's basic income are becoming contaminated by residues from the exotic preparations, creating products that are still saleable but carry their own burden of toxicity. Customers who purchase these seemingly normal wines are unknowingly exposing themselves to the same slow poisoning that is destroying Mnesikles and his inner circle of assistants. The economic consequences of Mnesikles' declining reliability begin to affect the entire island of Aegina. Orders for the workshop's products start to dwindle as word spreads about their dangerous effects, while the costs of obtaining the exotic ingredients for the experimental wines continue to escalate. the network of gatherers and suppliers that Mnesikles has established across the Mediterranean demands ever higher payments for materials that are becoming scarce due to overharvesting and the extreme risks involved in their collection. The preparation of this final wine becomes an obsession that consumes the last months of Mnesikles' life. He works with feverish intensity, driven by hallucinations and delusions that convince him he is racing against time to complete a work that will revolutionize human existence. The reality, visible to anyone not blinded by similar poisoning, is that he is creating the most concentrated poison ever devised, a liquid that contains lethal doses of dozens of different toxic compounds in combinations that amplify each other's destructive effects. As the final wine nears completion, strange reports begin reaching Aegina from across the Greek world. Ships arriving in the harbor carry news of mysterious illnesses affecting wine drinkers. In cities where Mnesikles products have been popular, physicians in Athens report an epidemic of trembling sickness among the wealthy patrons who frequent exclusive symposiums. Oracles at various temples begin experiencing visions so intense and disturbing that they are unable to function normally, leading to confusion and concern among the faithful who depend on divine guidance for important decisions. The end of Mnesikles' story arrives with the terrible inevitability of fate itself. On an autumn evening when the first cold winds begin to blow down from the mountains of the Peloponnese, the workshop has been closed to all visitors for 7 days as Mnesikles puts the finishing touches on his ultimate creation. The wine that he believes will grant him immortality and divine status among mortals. You stand in the courtyard outside the sealed building, listening to the sounds of your master's final preparations, the clinking of bronze vessels, the grinding of minerals being reduced to powder, and occasionally the sound of Mnesikles' voice raised in what might be prayer or might be the rambling discourse of a mind completely severed from reality. When the doors finally open, the man who emerges bears little resemblance to the confident craftsman you first knew 5 years ago. Mnesikles' hair has turned completely white despite his relatively young age, and his skin has taken on a grayish pallor that seems to glow faintly in the twilight. His movements are jerky and uncontrolled, as if his nervous system can no longer coordinate the complex muscle interactions required for smooth motion. Most disturbing of all are his eyes, which reflect light in an unusual way and seem to say things that exist only in his poisoned imagination. In his trembling hands, Mnesikles carries a single kylix, a drinking cup crafted from gold and inlaid with precious stones that seem to pulse with their own inner light. The vessel contains perhaps half a pint of liquid that appears to be wine, but exhibits properties that wine should never possess. The surface shimmers with colors that shift and change like oil on water, while vapor rises from it in patterns that seem almost geometric in their precision. Even from a distance of several feet, you can smell the metallic, bitter scent that emanates from the cup, an odor that makes your eyes water and your throat constrict. Mnesikles speaks, his voice hoarse and strangely musical, as if the toxic compounds in his system have affected the way sound resonates in his throat and mouth. He describes the contents of the cup in terms that blend wine terminology with mystical revelation, speaking of notes of eternal starlight, hints of divine transformation, and a finish that lasts beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. What he is actually describing is a chemical cocktail that contains lethal concentrations of every toxic substance he has encountered during his career, combined in proportions that would kill a dozen men and preserved in a solution so acidic that it has begun to etch patterns into the gold of the cup itself. The moment arrives when Mnesikles raises the cup to his lips, speaking a toast to Dionysus and to the transformation that awaits him on the other side of mortality. You want to intervene to knock the cup from his hands, but something in his manner, a dignity that persists even in the midst of complete madness, prevents you from interfering with what he clearly sees as the culmination of his life's work. As he drinks, his face registers a complex series of expressions that shift from satisfaction to surprise to something approaching terror as the full impact of the poison begins to make itself known. The effects are immediate and terrible. Mnesikles' body begins to convulse almost before he has finished swallowing the contents of the cup, and the golden vessel falls from his nerveless fingers to shatter on the stone floor of the courtyard. The liquid spreads in a pool that seems to eat into the stone itself, creating patterns of corrosion that will remain visible for years to come. His skin begins to change color, shifting through shades of blue and purple as his cardiovascular system fails under the assault of compounds that attack every major organ simultaneously. But even as his body dies, Mnesikles' poisoned mind interprets these symptoms as signs of successful transformation. His convulsions become what he describes as divine dancing, while the hallucinations caused by the massive dose of neurotoxins are experienced as visions of Olympian realms in conversations with the immortal beings. His final words, spoken in a voice that grows weaker with each syllable, describe the glorious apotheosis he believes he is experiencing, even as the objective reality around him testifies to nothing more than an agonizing death by self-administered poison. The death of Mnesikles sends shock waves throughout the wine trade of the ancient Mediterranean. Word spreads quickly from Aegina to the major commercial centers of Athens, Corinth, Rhodes, and beyond, carried by merchants who had been customers or competitors of the famous winemaker. The initial reaction is one of disbelief. How could someone so skilled in his craft have made such a fatal error? But as more details emerge about the circumstances of his death and the nature of his final creation, a different picture begins to take shape. You find yourself in a position of having to dispose of not only Mnesikles' body, but also the vast inventory of toxic wines he has created over the past several years. The immediate problem is the workshop itself, which has been so thoroughly contaminated by years of experimental winemaking that it poses a health hazard to anyone who enters it. The bronze vessels used for mixing have been corroded by acidic compounds into fantastic shapes that would be beautiful if they were not so dangerous. The wooden surfaces have absorbed enough toxic material to make them lethal to touch, while the stone floors and walls show the staining and etching patterns that mark the sites of countless chemical accidents. The inventory presents an even greater challenge. Hundreds of amphorae contain wines of varying degrees of toxicity, from relatively safe commercial products to experimental batches that could kill with a single swallow. There is no way to determine which containers hold deadly poison and which merely contain the normal level of contamination that characterized all of Mnesikles' work. The safest course would be to destroy everything, but the economic value of the inventory represents the lifetime savings of not only Mnesikles, but also his investors and business partners. As word of the tragedy spreads, customers who had purchased Mnesikles' wines begin to report their own experiences with the toxic effects of his products. Letters arrive from across the Greek world describing mysterious illnesses, bizarre behavior changes, and unexplained deaths among those who had consumed what they believed to be premium beverages. A pattern emerges of progressive poisoning that had been attributed to everything from divine displeasure to foreign curses, never suspected to originate from the very wines that were supposed to provide pleasure and enlightenment. The authorities on Aegina face a dilemma that has no precedent in Greek law or custom. While Mnesikles clearly caused harm to his customers, there is no evidence that he intended to poison them. Indeed, he consumed his own products enthusiastically and ultimately died from the same toxic effects that killed others. The concept of product liability based on unintended consequences does not exist in ancient legal thinking, which focuses on intent rather than result when determining responsibility for harm. The solution that eventually emerges reflects the pragmatic approach that characterizes Greek commerce and justice. The workshop and its entire inventory are declared cursed by the gods and are destroyed in a ritual burning that lasts for 3 days. The toxic materials create flames of unusual colors and release vapors that force the entire population of the area to evacuate temporarily, providing vivid evidence of the dangerous nature of what has been destroyed. The site of the workshop is declared sacred to Dionysus in his aspect as god of both ecstasy and destruction, ensuring that no one will attempt to rebuild or excavate there for generations to come. The broader impact of Mnesikles' death on Greek drinking culture is subtle but significant. Wine merchants throughout the Mediterranean begin to pay more attention to the sources and processing methods of their products, not from any scientific understanding of toxicity, but from the superstitious fear of repeating the tragedy that befell the famous craftsman. Traditional methods that have been passed down for generations are preserved more carefully, while experimental techniques that produce unusual effects are viewed with increased suspicion. The philosophical and religious implications of the Mnesikles affair generate discussions that continue for decades after his death. Some interpret his fate as punishment from the gods for hubris, the sin of attempting to achieve divinity through mortal craft. Others see it as evidence of the dangerous nature of all attempts to transcend normal human consciousness through chemical means. A few philosophers, influenced by the early stirrings of what will eventually become scientific thinking, begin to question whether the effects attributed to divine intervention might actually result from natural causes that could be understood and controlled. The medical profession, such as it exists in ancient Greece, struggles to make sense of the symptoms and death patterns associated with Mnesikles' wines. Physicians who had previously attributed mysterious illnesses to imbalances in the four humors began to consider the possibility that external substances might be capable of causing specific types of harm. This represents the beginning of a very slow evolution toward understanding toxicology, though it will be centuries before the scientific revolution provides the conceptual framework necessary for true comprehension of chemical poisoning. The story of Mnesikles becomes a cautionary tale that spreads throughout the ancient world, told and retold in symposiums, marketplaces, and workshops wherever wine is made or consumed. Like all such tales, it grows into telling, acquiring embellishments and moral lessons that reflect the concerns and fears of each generation that passes it on. Some versions emphasize the dangers of excessive ambition. Others focus on the folly of trying to improve upon the gifts of the gods. And still others use the story to warn against the seductive dangers of seeking transcendence through material means. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Mnesikles' legacy is how quickly the specific lessons of his experience are forgotten or misunderstood. Within a generation, new winemakers are experimenting with many of the same toxic techniques that killed him, driven by the same desires for innovation and distinction that motivated his own work. The cycle of discovery, experimentation, and poisoning continues, though usually on a smaller scale that attracts less attention and leaves fewer historical records. As you stand in the ruins of what was once the most famous wine workshop in the Greek world, watching the last wisps of smoke rise from the ritual fires that have destroyed years of accumulated toxicity, you reflect on the strange irony of a life dedicated to creating pleasure that ended in creating only pain. The techniques and knowledge that died with Mnesikles represented centuries of accumulated experience, in the craft of fermentation and blending, but they also embodied a fundamental ignorance about the chemical processes that underlay these traditional practices. The golden cup from which Mnesikles drank his final toast was never recovered from the ruins of the workshop, presumably melted by the intense heat of the ritual fires or dissolved by the acids it contained. But the memory of that moment, the sight of a brilliant mind destroyed by its own creations, remains vivid in your thoughts as you prepare to leave Aegina and seek new life in a profession that does not involve the daily handling of toxic substances. You carry with you not only the technical knowledge of winemaking that few others possess, but also the hard-won wisdom that some kinds of knowledge are too dangerous to pursue, and that the line between medicine and poison, between pleasure and death, is thinner than most people ever imagine. Let us now turn our attention from the lived experience of ancient toxicity to the silent testimony preserved beneath Mediterranean soil, where centuries of dangerous drinking have left their marks in ways that modern archaeology is only beginning to understand. Picture yourself descending into the cool darkness of an excavation site on the island of Crete, where the systematic layers of human habitation tell a story of gradual poisoning that spans millennia. The archaeological record speaks in a language of bones, pottery shards, and chemical residues that reveals truths about ancient Greek drinking culture that no written source ever recorded. In this particular excavation, located near the ancient Minoan palace of Knossos, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of brewing and distillation practices that predate the classical Greek period by over 1,000 years. The stratigraphy reveals layer upon layer of human activity, each marked by its own characteristic patterns of contamination and toxicity. The oldest levels show relatively simple fermentation techniques using basic clay vessels and natural ingredients. But as you move upward through time, the archaeological evidence documents an increasingly complex and dangerous relationship between humans and their alcoholic beverages. The pottery fragments, scattered throughout these ancient layers, tell their own story of gradual contamination and technological evolution. The earliest vessels, dating to the Bronze Age, show evidence of lead glazes and metallic additives that were already beginning the process of systematic poisoning that would characterize Mediterranean drinking culture for centuries to come. Chemical analysis of residues found inside these vessels reveals not only the expected signatures of fermented beverages, but also the unmistakable presence of heavy metals, plant alkaloids, and other compounds that modern science recognizes as highly toxic. One of the most intriguing discoveries in this excavation is an intact storage room that appears to have been sealed by earthquake activity sometime during the late Minoan period. Inside this time capsule, archaeologists have found dozens of perfectly preserved amphorae still containing the dried residues of ancient beverages. The analysis of these materials provides an unprecedented window into the chemical complexity of Bronze Age drinking culture, revealing formulations that make even Mnesikles toxic. Creations seem relatively benign by comparison. The amphorae and this sealed chamber bear markings that identified their contents as special ceremonial wines intended for religious festivals and royal celebrations. Chemical spectroscopy reveals that these beverages contained not only the expected alcohol and tannins from fermented grapes, but also mercury compounds, lead, acetate, arsenic sulfides, and organic alkaloids from a bewildering variety of plant sources. The concentrations of these toxic materials are so high that a single cup of any of these ancient wines would have been sufficient to cause severe poisoning or death in a modern person. Adjacent to the storage room, excavators have uncovered what appears to be an ancient laboratory or workshop where these ceremonial beverages were prepared. The room contains stone tables stained with chemical residues, bronze vessels corroded by acidic compounds, and collections of minerals and plant materials that read like a catalog of ancient toxicology. Grinding stones show traces of cinnabar, realgar, and other mercury and arsenic compounds, while mortars and pestles contain residues from plants that modern botanists recognize as members of the nightshade spurge and euphorbia families. The human remains associated with this site tell their own grim story of the consequences of regular exposure to these toxic beverages. Skeletal analysis reveals bone lesions characteristic of chronic heavy metal poisoning, while dental remains show the distinctive blue-gray staining that results from lead exposure. Hair samples preserved in the dry conditions of sealed tombs contained concentrations of mercury, lead, and arsenic that would be considered evidence of acute poisoning by modern medical standards. Perhaps most disturbing are the remains of individuals who appear to have died during or shortly after consuming these ceremonial beverages. Their bones show evidence of rapid, catastrophic organ failure, while analysis of preserved stomach contents reveals the same toxic cocktails found in the ceremonial amphorae. These individuals, probably priests or nobles who participated in religious festivals, literally poisoned themselves to death in the pursuit of what they believed to be communion with divine forces. The cultural significance of these archaeological discoveries becomes clearer when considered alongside similar findings from other sites across the Mediterranean world. Excavations in Sicily have revealed Roman-era wine cellars where the storage vessels show such severe chemical contamination that the surrounding soil remains toxic 2,000 years after the last wine was stored there. On the island of Rhodes, underwater archaeology has uncovered the remains of ancient merchant ships whose wine cargoes have created dead zones on the seafloor where nothing can grow due to the leaching of heavy metals from corroded amphorae. The patterns revealed by this archaeological evidence suggests that dangerous drinking was not an aberration or accident in ancient Mediterranean culture, but rather a central feature of religious, social, and economic life. The most toxic beverages were reserved for the most important occasions: religious festivals, royal celebrations, diplomatic ceremonies, and rites of passage. The very toxicity that modern science recognizes as deadly was interpreted by ancient peoples as evidence of divine power and spiritual significance. Chemical analysis of residues from different geographical regions reveals distinct patterns of contamination that reflect local geology, available plant species, and cultural traditions. Wine from volcanic regions shows consistently high levels of sulfur compounds and trace elements that were absorbed by grapevines from mineral-rich soils. Beverages from limestone regions contain calcium and magnesium, compounds that interacted with other ingredients during fermentation to create entirely new categories of toxic substances. Coastal areas, with their access to marine resources, show evidence of seaweed and fish-based additives that contributed iodine, mercury, and other oceanic contaminants to the toxic mix. The technological evolution documented in the archaeological record shows a clear trend toward increasingly sophisticated methods of concentration and purification that had the unintended effect of making beverages more rather than less dangerous. Early Bronze Age fermentation techniques produced relatively weak alcoholic drinks with moderate levels of contamination from natural sources. But as metallurgy advanced and trade networks expanded, winemakers gained access to pure metals, refined minerals, and exotic plants that allowed them to create far more potent and toxic formulations. The bronze vessels used in later periods for wine preparation show evidence of advanced metallurgy that created alloys specifically designed for their supposed beneficial effects on wine. These alloys, containing carefully calculated proportions of copper, tin, lead, and other metals, were believed to improve the flavor and healthful properties of wine through contact during storage and serving. What actually happened was that these metal surfaces became sources of steady contamination, leaching toxic compounds into every batch of wine they touched. The distribution of toxic materials across archaeological sites provides insight into the social stratification of ancient poisoning. Elite residences and religious complexes show the highest concentrations of exotic and dangerous substances, suggesting that access to the most potent toxic beverages was a mark of high social status. Common residential areas show lower but still significant levels of contamination, indicating that even ordinary citizens were regularly exposed to dangerous drinking practices. Though perhaps not to the same extreme degree as their social superiors. Trade networks documented through archaeological evidence revealed the Mediterranean-wide scope of the ancient toxic beverage industry. Amphora shirts from Aegean sites show up in excavations as far away as southern Spain and the Black Sea coast, carrying with them chemical signatures that identify their toxic contents. Similarly, exotic ingredients like cinnabar from Spanish mines and rare herbs from North African mountains appear in winemaking contexts throughout the Greek world, demonstrating the international nature of ancient chemical warfare against human health. The religious and cultural artifacts associated with drinking practices provide another layer of archaeological evidence for the central role of toxic beverages in ancient spiritual life. Votive offerings at temples include miniature cups and vessels that show the same chemical contamination as full-size drinking implements, suggesting that even religious dedications were made using poisonous materials. Temple complexes contain specialized rooms that appear to have been dedicated to the preparation of sacred beverages, with equipment and residues that indicate industrial-scale production of toxic drinks for religious festivals and ceremonies. Funerary contexts provide particularly rich sources of information about the role of dangerous drinking in ancient death rituals. Many elite burials include elaborate drinking sets made from precious metals and decorated with religious imagery. But chemical analysis reveals that these beautiful objects are also repositories of lethal contamination. The practice of burying the dead with their personal drinking vessels has preserved samples of the actual beverages consumed by individuals whose remains show clear evidence of chronic poisoning. Some of the most significant archaeological discoveries relate to the medical and pharmaceutical applications of what modern science would classify as poisons. Excavations at healing temples dedicated to Asclepius have uncovered extensive collections of toxic substances that were apparently used as medicines. These include not only the familiar heavy metals like mercury and lead, but also organic compounds extracted from poisonous plants, radioactive minerals that were valued for their supposed healing properties, and chemical preparations that would be classified as biological weapons by modern standards. The archaeological record also documents the gradual recognition by ancient peoples that their beloved beverages were causing harm. Later Roman period sites show evidence of attempts to reduce contamination through improved storage techniques, water filtration systems, and the use of alternative materials for vessels and equipment. These innovations, while still primitive by modern standards, represent the beginning of a slow evolution toward safer drinking practices that would not be fully realized until the scientific revolution of the modern era. The preservation of organic materials in certain archaeological contexts has provided unprecedented insight into the botanical components of ancient toxic beverages. Analysis of plant remains from sealed storage contexts reveals that ancient winemakers had access to and regularly used dozens of species that modern pharmacology recognizes as containing potent psychoactive and toxic compounds. These include not only obvious candidates like members of the nightshade and poppy families, but also seemingly innocent plants like certain mints, roses, and even common garden herbs that can become deadly when concentrated or combined with other substances. Patterns of contamination revealed by archaeological chemistry also shed light on unintended consequences of ancient technological processes. Sites that show evidence of metalworking, ceramic production, and other industrial activities also display elevated levels of environmental contamination that affected local food and water supplies. The proximity of workshops to residential areas meant that entire communities were exposed to toxic materials, not only through their deliberately prepared beverages, but also through contaminated groundwater, soil, and air. Modern archaeological techniques have made it possible to trace the movement of specific toxic substances across vast distances and time periods through their chemical signatures. Lead isotope analysis can identify the specific mines that provided the metal found in ancient wine vessels, revealing trade networks that connected the most remote corners of the Mediterranean world in a web of inadvertent poisoning. Similar techniques applied to plant alkaloids and other organic compounds are beginning to map the botanical sources of ancient toxicity with unprecedented precision. The cumulative picture that emerges from all this archaeological evidence is of ancient Mediterranean civilization as a vast, unintentional experiment in chemical toxicology that lasted for centuries and affected millions of people. The sophistication and beauty of ancient Greek culture was achieved by people who were systematically poisoning themselves through their most cherished cultural practices, creating a paradox that modern science is only beginning to understand and document through the patient work of archaeological investigation. The role of toxic beverages in ancient Greek religious and cultural practices presents one of the most complex puzzles in the archaeological and anthropological study of Mediterranean civilizations. As we examine the intersection between sacred ritual and systematic poisoning, a fascinating pattern emerges that challenges our understanding of both ancient spirituality, and the chemical basis of religious experience. The mystery deepens when we consider that many of the most profound and influential philosophical and religious insights of the ancient world may have been the direct result of neurological damage caused by regular consumption of toxic beverages. The Eleusinian Mysteries, perhaps the most famous religious ceremony of the ancient Greek world, centered around the consumption of a sacred drink called kykeon. For over 1,000 years, initiates from across the Mediterranean world traveled to Eleusis to participate in rituals that promised direct communication with divine forces and revelation, the deepest secrets of existence. Classical sources describe the profound visions and transformative experiences that resulted from consuming the kykeon, but they provide few details about its actual composition, maintaining the secrecy that was central to the mystery tradition. Modern archaeological investigation of sites associated with the Eleusinian Mysteries has revealed chemical evidence that suggests the kykeon was far more than a simple mixture of barley, water, and mint, as suggested by some ancient sources. Analysis of residues from vessels found in the sacred precinct at Eleusis shows traces of ergot alkaloids, compounds that modern science recognizes as powerful hallucinogens with dangerous side effects. These chemicals, produced by fungal infections of grain crops, can cause not only vivid hallucinations and mystical experiences, but also gangrene, convulsions, and death. The cultural significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. If the transformative visions that formed the core of the Eleusinian experience were actually symptoms of ergot poisoning, then one of the most influential religious traditions in Western civilization was based on what amounted to ritualized chemical intoxication. The initiates, who claimed to have seen divine visions and gained profound spiritual insights, may have been experiencing nothing more than the neurological effects of accidentally ingesting fungal toxins. But the mystery deepens when we consider the sophisticated knowledge that would have been required to consistently produce kykeon with the right concentration of psychoactive compounds to create mystical experiences without killing the participants. Ergot alkaloids are notoriously difficult to control. Too little produces no effect, while too much causes agonizing death. The fact that the Eleusinian Mysteries continued for over a millennium without apparent mass casualties suggests that the priests who prepared the sacred drink possessed empirical knowledge about dosage and preparation that allowed them to safely navigate this narrow margin between transcendence and death. Archaeological evidence from other mystery religions throughout the ancient Mediterranean reveals similar patterns of sophisticated chemical manipulation disguised as religious ritual. Excavations at the sanctuary of Dionysus at Delphi have uncovered evidence of wine preparation techniques that involve the systematic cultivation of ergot-infected grains, the careful harvesting and processing of toxic plants, and the use of specialized equipment designed to concentrate psychoactive compounds. The oracle's famous prophecies, delivered in states of divine possession, may have been the direct result of carefully controlled chemical intoxication. The cultural implications of this interpretation extend far beyond the realm of religious studies into the very foundations of Western philosophy and literature. Many of the greatest thinkers of the ancient world were regular participants in mystery religions and symposium culture, both of which involved the consumption of beverages that modern analysis reveals to have been systematically contaminated with psychoactive substances. The philosophical insights of Plato, the dramatic innovations of Aeschylus, the historical narratives of Herodotus, all may have been influenced by altered states of consciousness induced by chemical intoxication. The archaeological record provides abundant evidence for the widespread use of what can only be described as chemical enhancers in various cultural contexts throughout the ancient Greek world. Athletic competitions, artistic performances, political assemblies, and educational institutions all show evidence of environments where psychoactive beverages were regularly consumed. The famous symposium tradition, which combined intellectual discussion with social drinking, appears to have been designed specifically to create the mild chemical intoxication that participants believed enhanced their cognitive abilities and creative insights. Techniques used to create these cultural drugs reveal a level of sophistication that challenges conventional assumptions about ancient scientific knowledge. Chemical analysis of residues from symposium vessels shows evidence of complex preparation methods that involved controlled fermentation, selective extraction of plant compounds, and careful blending of materials from diverse geographical sources. The consistency of these chemical signatures across different sites and time periods suggests the existence of standardized recipes and preparation techniques that were passed down through generations of practitioners. The social stratification of access to different types of psychoactive beverages provides insight into the relationship between chemical intoxication and political power in ancient Greek society. The most exotic and dangerous substances appear primarily in elite contexts, royal palaces, aristocratic symposiums, and exclusive religious ceremonies. Common citizens had access to milder versions of the same basic chemical experiences, but the most intense and transformative substances were reserved for those with the wealth and social connections necessary to obtain rare ingredients and expert preparation services. The cultural mystery deepens when we consider the apparent absence of any recognition by ancient peoples that their religious and intellectual achievements were chemically mediated. The extensive literature produced by Greek philosophers, historians, and poets contains virtually no acknowledgement that their insights and inspirations might be the result of altered brain chemistry rather than divine intervention or natural genius. This blindness to the chemical basis of their cultural achievements represents one of the most fascinating aspects of ancient Greek civilization. Modern neuroscience and pharmacology provide tools for understanding the physiological mechanisms underlying the cultural practices documented in the archaeological record. The plant alkaloids, heavy metals, and other toxic substances found in ancient drinking vessels are known to affect specific neurotransmitter systems in ways that can produce enhanced pattern recognition, increased verbal fluency, altered time perception, and intensified emotional responses, precisely the effects that ancient Greeks attributed to divine inspiration and intellectual enhancement. The geographical distribution of different psychoactive substances in the archaeological record reveals the existence of trade networks specifically dedicated to supplying the ingredients for cultural intoxication. Rare plants from the mountains of Asia Minor appear in winemaking contexts in Sicily, while minerals from Spanish mines show up in religious contexts throughout the Aegean world. This international traffic in mind-altering substances represents one of the earliest examples of what might be called a global drug trade, though one that operated within culturally sanctioned religious and social frameworks. The seasonal patterns evident in the archaeological record suggest that the production and consumption of psychoactive beverages was carefully coordinated with agricultural cycles and religious calendars. The timing of major festivals and ceremonies appears to have been determined partly by the availability of specific plants at the optimal stage of their growth cycle for maximum psychoactive potency. This coordination between cultural practices and botanical chemistry indicates a level of empirical knowledge about natural pharmacology that rivals modern understanding in some respects. The mystery of how ancient peoples acquired this sophisticated chemical knowledge without the benefit of modern analytical techniques remains one of the most intriguing aspects of ancient toxicological practices. The trial and error process necessary to identify effective psychoactive plants, determine optimal preparation methods, and establish safe dosage ranges would have required the sacrifice of countless experimental subjects over generations of gradual refinement. The human cost of developing these cultural technologies must have been enormous, though it remains largely invisible in the historical record. The archaeological evidence for sophisticated chemical knowledge in ancient Greek drinking culture points toward the existence of what can only be described as a lost science of pharmacology that operated within religious, social frameworks rather than medical ones. This hidden tradition of chemical manipulation appears to have been passed down through networks of priests, craftsmen, and elite practitioners who understood the physiological effects of various substances without possessing the theoretical framework that would allow them to articulate this knowledge in scientific terms. The complexity of the chemical preparations documented in the archaeological record suggests that ancient practitioners had developed empirical methods for standardizing the potency and effects of their psychoactive beverages. Chemical analysis reveals that similar formulations appear at sites separated by hundreds of miles and decades of time, indicating the existence of reliable techniques for reproducing specific chemical effects. This consistency could only have been achieved through systematic experimentation and careful record-keeping, though the records themselves have not survived in any recognizable form. The botanical knowledge implicit in these ancient chemical practices represents an understanding of plant pharmacology that in some areas exceeds modern scientific knowledge. Ancient practitioners appear to have known not only which plants contain psychoactive compounds, but also how these effects varied with growing conditions, harvesting methods, processing techniques, and combinations with other substances. Modern pharmacognosy is only beginning to catalog the full range of bioactive compounds present in the plants that ancient Greeks used routinely in their beverage preparations. The metallurgical aspects of ancient toxic beverage production reveal an understanding of chemical processes that parallels developments in alchemy and protochemistry. The specific alloys used in wine preparation vessels were designed to catalyze particular chemical reactions that would enhance or modify the psychoactive properties of the beverages they contained. The knowledge required to create these specialized alloys suggests a level of theoretical understanding about the relationship between metallic composition and chemical reactivity that was not formally documented until much later in history. The archaeological evidence also points toward the existence of quality control methods that allowed ancient producers to ensure consistency in their chemical preparations. Standardized vessel sizes, measuring devices, and processing equipment appeared throughout the Mediterranean world in contexts associated with psychoactive beverage production. The precision of these tools suggests that ancient practitioners understood the critical importance of accurate dosing when working with substances that could be lethal in excessive quantities. The decline and eventual disappearance of these sophisticated chemical traditions represents one of the great losses in human knowledge. The combination of secrecy surrounding mystery religions, the oral tradition of craft knowledge, and the social upheavals that marked the end of the ancient world resulted in the complete loss of empirical knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of careful experimentation. Modern attempts to reconstruct these lost techniques through archaeological chemistry and experimental replication have achieved only limited success in recovering the sophisticated understanding that ancient practitioners took for granted. As twilight settles over the marble terraces of a grand villa overlooking the Bay of Salamis, we enter the rarefied world of the Athenian elite, where the most dangerous beverages in the ancient world were consumed with the greatest ceremony and sophistication. Here, in the homes of wealthy merchants, aristocratic families, and influential philosophers, the art of poisonous drinking reached its most refined and deadly expression. The contrast between the elegance of these gatherings and the systematic destruction of their participants. Health creates a paradox that illuminates the complex relationship between culture, status, and self-destruction in ancient Greek society. Picture yourself as Callicrates, a wealthy ship owner whose fleet carries luxury goods between Athens and the colonies of Asia Minor. Your symposium this evening brings together the most influential men of the city. Pericles himself may grace your couches, along with philosophers from the academy, generals fresh from victories in distant lands, and poets whose words will outlive empires. The preparation for such an evening requires months of planning and enormous expense, as every element must reflect the refinement and sophistication that marks your social status. That the drinking vessels arranged throughout your symposium room represent a fortune in precious metals and artistic craftsmanship. Silver calyxes bear the signatures of the most celebrated metalworkers in Athens, their surfaces decorated with scenes from Homer that seem to come alive in the flickering light of oil lamps. Golden rhytons, shaped like lion heads and mythical beasts, serve not merely as containers, but as statements of wealth and artistic taste. Each piece has been crafted not only for beauty, but for its supposed beneficial effects on the wine it contains, though the reality is that these precious metals contribute their own burden of toxicity to every drink served. The wines selected for this evening's symposium represent the pinnacle of ancient viticulture and chemical manipulation. The centerpiece is a vintage from the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, aged for 12 years in amphorae, sealed with a mixture of pine, resin, beeswax, and lead compounds. This wine, considered among the finest in the Mediterranean world, owes its exceptional flavor partly to the volcanic soil that has enriched it with an array of heavy metals, and partly to the line-lined storage vessels that have concentrated these toxins during the long aging process. Accompanying its crown jewel are wines from across the Greek world, each selected for its unique properties and prestigious origins. A sparkling wine from Syracuse, created through a secondary fermentation process that traps carbon dioxide and concentrates organic acids into liver-attacking compounds. A sweet wine from Samos, fortified with honey that contains natural toxins from bees that feed on oleander and other poisonous plants. A dark, almost black wine from the volcanic islands of the northern Aegean, so rich in mineral compounds that it leaves a metallic aftertaste that connoisseurs prize as evidence of its authenticity and power. The water used for Tinades, precious wines, comes from your private well, sunk deep into the bedrock beneath your estate. This water, prized for its clarity and supposed purity, actually represents one of the most concentrated sources of geological toxins available in the ancient world. The deep aquifer from which it is drawn has flowed through lead-bearing rock formations for centuries, concentrating not only lead, but also mercury, arsenic, and radioactive elements into a solution that would horrify a modern geologist, but that ancient Greeks considered the height of luxury. And HEALTHFULNESS. The slaves who serve at your symposium have been trained in the elaborate rituals that surround elite drinking culture, but they are also unwitting participants in the systematic poisoning that characterizes these gatherings. The young men who mix wine and water in the great silver craters are exposed to toxic vapors with every breath, while the cupbearers, who ensure that no guest vessel remains empty-handed, contaminated vessels throughout the long evening. Their lower social status means they receive no medical attention for the symptoms of chronic poisoning that gradually manifest in tremors, vision problems, and behavioral changes that are attributed to their foreign birth or inferior breeding. As the evening's first phase begins with a ritual libation to the gods, you observe the assembled company with pride and satisfaction. These are the men who shaped the destiny of Athens and the wider Greek world. Their decisions in the assembly determined questions of war and peace. Their investments drive the economy that spans the Mediterranean. Their artistic and intellectual achievements define what it means to be civilized. What you cannot see is that every one of them shows the subtle signs of chronic heavy metal poisoning that results from regular participation in symposium culture. Pericles himself, the great statesman whose vision has transformed Athens into the jewel of the ancient world, displays the characteristic pale complexion and slight hand tremor that mark advanced lead poisoning. His brilliant oratory, which can sway the assembly and inspire citizens to great deeds, is delivered by a nervous system under constant chemical assault. The very eloquence and intellectual acuity that make him the greatest political leader of his generation may be enhanced by the neurological effects of the toxic beverages he consumes at gatherings like this one. The philosopher Anaxagoras, reclining on the couch next to yours, engages in animated discussion about the nature of mind and matter, his insights flowing with a clarity and originality that will influence thinking for centuries to come. What he attributes to divine inspiration and natural intellectual gifts is actually the result of altered brain chemistry caused by regular consumption of beverages contaminated with psychoactive plant alkaloids and heavy metals. His famous theory about the role of mind in organizing the cosmos may be a direct reflection of the disorganized mental processes caused by chronic poisoning. As the evening progresses and the wine flows more freely, the conversation becomes increasingly animated and philosophically ambitious. Topics range from the nature of justice to the possibility of human flight. Kate, from mathematical theorems to the best methods for training horses. The intellectual ferment that characterizes these gatherings has contributed to many of the greatest achievements of Greek civilization, but it is fueled by chemical processes that no participant understands or recognizes. The mixing of wine with water, performed with elaborate ceremony in the great silver craters, represents not the dilution of alcohol for temperance, but the creation of complex chemical solutions that multiply the toxic effects of their individual components. The bronze ladles used for stirring contribute copper compounds, while the silver vessels leach metallic ions that interact with organic acids in the wine to create entirely new categories of poisonous substances. The ritual proportions 3 parts water to 1 part wine for normal drinking, or equal parts for stronger effects, have been established through generations of empirical observation about the relationship between concentration and desired psychological effects. The entertainment provided during the symposium includes musicians playing lyres and flutes, their performances enhanced by the consumption of the same toxic beverages that affect their audience. The subtle alterations in perception caused by heavy metal poisoning create an enhanced appreciation for musical harmonies and rhythmic patterns, leading participants to believe that wine genuinely improves their aesthetic sensibilities. The reality is that their poisoned nervous systems are processing auditory information in abnormal ways that create false impressions of enhanced beauty and meaning. The practice of katabos, the wine-flicking game that serves as both entertainment and religious ritual, distributes concentrated toxins throughout the symposium room with each playful gesture. The wine dregs that participants flick at various targets contain the highest concentrations of heavy metals and other contaminants, having settled out of solution during the drinking process. As these poison-laden droplets scatter through the air, they create an aerosol of toxic compounds that everyone in the room inhales, adding yet another vector for systematic poisoning to an already dangerous environment. The elaborate dining that accompanies the drinking represents another layer of toxic exposure, as the finest delicacies available to the ancient world often carry their own chemical burdens. Oysters and other shellfish, prized for their supposed aphrodisiac properties, concentrate heavy metals from polluted harbors where ships dump ballast and metalworking shops discharge their waste. Exotic spices from distant lands, valued for their rarity and supposed medicinal benefits, include plants that contain natural toxins in concentrations that can affect brain function and organ health. The philosophical discussions that emerge from these chemical-enhanced gatherings often center on topics that reflect the altered mental states of the participants. Debates about the nature of reality and the reliability of sensory experience take on particular poignancy when conducted by men whose perception of reality is systematically distorted by neurotoxic compounds. The famous Socratic method of questioning assumptions and examining beliefs may have evolved partly as a response to the obvious inconsistencies in thinking and memory that result from chronic poisoning. The political decisions made in these rarefied social contexts carry consequences that extend far beyond the symposium room to affect the lives of thousands of citizens and subject peoples throughout the Athenian Empire. Military campaigns are planned, alliances negotiated, and domestic policies formulated by men whose judgment is compromised by regular exposure to mind-altering substances. The famous Athenian democracy, praised by historians as a pinnacle of political achievement, operated through institutions staffed by officials whose cognitive abilities were systematically impaired by their participation in elite drinking culture. The artistic and literary achievements that emerge from symposium culture represent the products of minds operating under chemical influence, though this influence remains completely unrecognized by both creators and consumers of ancient Greek art. The complex meters and intricate wordplay of lyric poetry, the sophisticated plot structures of tragic drama, the elegant proportions of architectural design, all may reflect the altered pattern recognition and enhanced verbal fluency that result from specific types of typos, neurological damage caused by heavy metal exposure. The religious and mystical experiences reported by participants in elite drinking culture often involve visions, prophetic insights, and direct communication with divine beings that modern neuroscience would recognize as symptoms of chemical intoxication. The integration of these experiences into mainstream Greek religious thinking means that some of the most fundamental beliefs about the nature of gods and their relationship to humanity may be based on nothing more than the predictable effects of toxic beverages on human brain chemistry. The economic implications of elite drinking culture extend throughout ancient Mediterranean society, as the demand for exotic wines and rare ingredients drives trade networks that span from Spain to the Black Sea. Entire industries exist to supply the materials needed for sophisticated poisoning, from the miners who extract heavy metals to the botanical specialists who gather rare psychoactive plants. The wealth generated by this trade in toxic luxury goods helps finance the military expeditions, public works projects, and cultural achievements that defined the golden age of ancient Greece. The medical profession of the ancient world struggles to understand and treat the health problems that result from elite drinking practices, lacking the conceptual framework necessary to recognize systematic chemical poisoning. Physicians trained in the theory of humors and the balance of bodily fluids attribute the symptoms of heavy metal toxicity to natural imbalances that can be corrected through bloodletting, dietary changes, and the administration of medicines that often contain the same toxic substances that caused the original problems. The generational effects of elite drinking culture create family dynasties marked by progressively worsening health and increasingly erratic behavior as toxic substances accumulate in bloodlines over multiple generations. The famous political families of Athens often show patterns of mental instability, physical weakness, and early death that historians attribute to the stresses of public life and the corruption of power, never recognizing the role of hereditary poisoning in creating these tragic patterns. While the elite of ancient Athens refined the art of elegant self-destruction in their marble symposiums, the vast majority of the population experienced their own versions of systematic poisoning through the beverages that formed the foundation of daily life for common citizens. The wine shops, taverns, and public fountains that served ordinary Greeks dispensed their own varieties of toxic cocktails, often more immediately dangerous than the sophisticated poisons consumed by the wealthy, if less exotic in their composition and preparation. The contrast between elite and common drinking practices reveals the democratic nature of ancient Greek poisoning. While the wealthy might kill themselves slowly with rare wines aged in light-lined amphorae and flavored with mercury compounds, ordinary citizens faced more immediate dangers from contaminated water supplies, adulterated wines, and the toxic byproducts of urban life that found their way into every cup and bowl. The result was a society where systematic chemical assault on human health crossed all social boundaries, affecting everyone from slaves to senators, though in different ways and at different rates. Consider the experience of Lysias, a working potter whose daily routine exposes him to a constant stream of toxic beverages through both his profession and his social life. His workshop, located in the Keramikos district, where the city's ceramic industry clusters around sources of suitable clay, operates in an environment where the very air is saturated with dust from lead-based glazes and pigments. The water he uses to thin clay and clean tools comes from wells that have been contaminated by decades of ceramic production, while the wine he drinks during midday breaks carries additional toxins from the industrial environment that surrounds his workplace. The pottery vessels that Lysias creates for everyday use by ordinary Athenians represent a perfect example of how craftsmanship and toxicity intersect in ancient Greek daily life. The beautiful black figure and red figure decorations that adorn even common drinking cups require glazes containing lead compounds in concentrations that would be illegal in modern manufacturing. Every cup that leaves his workshop carries within its fired clay matrix a burden of toxic materials that will leach into whatever liquid it contains, slowly poisoning every person who uses it over the months and years of its functional life. The communal nature of ancient Greek drinking culture means that contamination spreads rapidly through populations as vessels are shared, reused, and passed from hand to hand in social settings. The local tavern where Lysias and his fellow craftsmen gather after work serves wine from large clay storage jars that have absorbed toxic materials from hundreds of previous batches, creating a cumulative contamination that affects everyone who drinks from the establishment. The bronze serving vessels used to ladle wine from storage to individual cups contribute their own metallic toxins with every pour, while the wooden tables and benches become saturated with spilled wine that ferments and develops new toxic compounds over time. The water supply system that serves common residential districts represents one of the most dangerous aspects of daily life for ordinary Athenians, though it is also one of the most invisible. The lead pipes that carry water from mountain springs to urban fountains leach toxic compounds continuously, concentrating heavy metals in the supply that feeds the entire population. The public fountains, where citizens fill their daily water vessels, show the characteristic staining and corrosion that mark chronic lead exposure, while the bronze spouts and decorative elements contribute additional metallic contamination to every jug filled at these communal sources. The bread and wine that form the foundation of the Greek diet create a daily double exposure to toxic compounds that affects every citizen regardless of social status. The grain used for bread often contains ergot, fungi, and other natural contaminants that produce psychoactive effects, while the processing methods used by commercial bakers introduce additional toxins from lead glaze, ovens, and contaminated water supplies. When this toxic bread is consumed alongside wine that has its own burden of heavy metals and organic poisons, the result is a daily chemical assault that gradually accumulates in human tissues over decades of tissues exposure. The religious festivals and public celebrations that punctuate the Greek calendar provide opportunities for massive communal exposure to toxic beverages, as entire populations participate in ritual drinking. The wine distributed at these events comes from the same contaminated sources that supply elite symposiums, but it is consumed in larger quantities and with less attention to quality control. The bronze mixing bowls used to prepare wine for public consumption are often borrowed from multiple households, spreading contamination across family lines and social groups that might otherwise remain isolated from each other's toxic exposures. The occupational hazards faced by different categories of workers create distinct patterns of poisoning that reflect the specific toxic materials associated with various trades. Metal workers face constant exposure to mercury, lead, and other heavy metals through their work with alloys and soldering compounds, while their daily wine consumption adds additional heavy metal exposure from contaminated beverages. Leather workers deal with toxic tanning compounds that affect their skin and respiratory systems, while the wine they drink during work breaks introduces a different set of chemical hazards through their digestive systems. The seasonal patterns of agricultural work create cyclical exposures to different types of toxic materials as common citizens participate in harvesting, processing, and storing the grapes that will become next year's wine supply. The pestilent compounds used to protect grapevines from insects and diseases include arsenic, mercury, and various plant-based toxins that concentrate in the fruit and persist through the fermentation process. Workers who participate in grape harvesting absorb these compounds through their skin and respiratory systems, while also consuming contaminated grape juice. During the long days of harvest labor, the urban environment of ancient Athens creates its own unique sources of toxic exposure that affect the daily drinking water and wine consumed by ordinary citizens. The waste products from metalworking shops, ceramic kilns, and leather tanning operations flow into the same water sources that supply residential districts, while the smoke from countless small furnaces and cooking fires carries toxic particles that settle into water storage vessels and wine jars throughout the city. The density of urban population means that contamination spreads rapidly and affects large numbers of people. Simultaneously, the folk medicine practices that ordinary Greeks used to treat illness often involve the consumption of herbal preparations that contain the same toxic compounds found in contaminated wine and water. Traditional remedies for common ailments include plants from the nightshade family, preparations containing mercury and lead compounds, and various organic substances that modern pharmacology recognizes as dangerous poisons. The combination of daily toxic exposure through food and drink with additional exposure through medical treatment creates a double burden of contamination that accelerates the development of chronic health problems. The social drinking customs that govern everyday life among common citizens create opportunities for toxic exposure that go beyond the simple consumption of contaminated beverages. The practice of sharing cups and vessels during communal drinking sessions spreads contamination between individuals, while the reuse of containers without adequate cleaning allows toxic residues to accumulate and concentrate over time. The custom of offering drinks to guests and strangers extends networks of contamination throughout communities, across social boundaries. As our journey through the dangerous drinking culture of ancient Greece draws toward its close, we must pause to contemplate the terrible democracy of chemical destruction that united all levels of society in a common fate of slow, systematic poisoning. From the marble-columned villas of the Athenian elite to the cramped workshops of common artisans, from the sacred precincts of mystery temples to the humble taverns frequented by laborers and slaves, the same toxic substances flowed through the bloodstreams of an entire civilization, creating a shared destiny that transcended all social barriers and political divisions. The wealthy symposium culture that we observed in aristocratic homes represents only the most visible and well-documented aspect of a much larger phenomena that affected every person who lived within the sphere of Greek civilization. The rare wines aged in lead-lined amphorae, the exotic herbs gathered from distant mountains, the precious metals crafted into drinking vessels of surpassing beauty. All of these luxury items were merely the most concentrated, expensive versions of toxic practices that permeated society at every level. The same lead that flavored the wine of Pericles also contaminated the water drunk by the slaves who built his monuments, while the same mercury compounds that enhanced the mystical experiences of wealthy initiates into mystery religions also found their way into the cheap wine sold in working-class taverns. This universality of exposure created a unique form of social equality in ancient Greek society, an equality of suffering that operated alongside and sometimes in contradiction to the obvious inequalities of wealth, power, and social status. A wealthy merchant might consume exotic wines that cost more than a common laborer earned in a year, but both men were systematically destroying their nervous systems with the same categories of toxic compounds. The aristocrats' lead poisoning might progress more slowly due to better nutrition and medical care, but it was no less certain or devastating in its ultimate effects than the rapid contamination experienced by those whose poverty forced them to drink from the most polluted sources. The generational effects of this universal contamination created patterns of decline and degeneration that affected entire bloodlines and family dynasties across the social spectrum. Elite families, despite their wealth and access to the best medical care available in the ancient world, showed the same patterns of mental instability, physical weakness, and early death that characterized families from lower social classes. The concentration of toxic compounds in bloodlines over multiple generations meant that children were born with prenatal exposure to heavy metals and organic poisons, creating hereditary burdens that accumulated across centuries of exposure. The intellectual and cultural achievements of ancient Greek civilization take on a different character when viewed through the lens of systematic chemical contamination. The philosophical insights of Plato and Aristotle, the dramatic innovations of Aeschylus and Sophocles, the mathematical discoveries of Pythagoras and Euclid, all were produced by minds operating under the influence of psychoactive substances and neurological damage that their creators never recognized or understood. The very brilliance of Greek culture may have been partly the result of the altered pattern recognition and enhanced verbal fluency that result from specific types of brain damage caused by chronic heavy metal exposure. The religious and mystical traditions that formed the foundation of Greek spiritual life were similarly shaped by the chemical realities of daily existence in a toxically contaminated society. The visions experienced by oracles and mystics, the divine inspirations claimed by poets and prophets, the transcendent insights achieved through participation in mystery religions, all may have been nothing more than the predictable neurological effects of consuming beverages contaminated with psychoactive plant alkaloids and heavy metals. The gods and goddesses of the Greek pantheon may have been chemical hallucinations, elevated to divine status by a population that lacked any understanding of the pharmaceutical basis of their religious experiences. The political institutions of ancient Greece, celebrated by historians as the foundation of democratic government and rational political discourse, operated through assemblies and councils staffed by officials whose judgment was systematically impaired by chemical contamination. The famous Athenian democracy made its most important decisions through processes that involved thousands of citizens whose cognitive abilities had been compromised by lifelong exposure to toxic beverages. The speeches of great orators like Demosthenes and Pericles may have been delivered by men whose eloquence was enhanced by neurological damage, while their audiences evaluated these arguments with brains that had been systematically altered by chronic poisoning. The military achievements of ancient Greece, from the victory at Marathon to the conquests of Alexander, were accomplished by armies whose soldiers were sustained by contaminated food and water supplies. The famous courage of Spartan warriors and the tactical brilliance of Athenian generals may have been partly the result of the altered pain perception and enhanced aggression that result from certain types of heavy metal poisoning. The phalanx formation that dominated ancient warfare required precise coordination between soldiers whose nervous systems were under constant chemical assault, while the strategic planning that guided military campaigns was developed by commanders whose thinking processes had been shaped by decades of toxic exposure. The artistic and architectural monuments that survive as testaments to Greek achievement were created by craftsmen and laborers whose tools were fashioned from contaminated metals and whose daily sustenance came from polluted sources. The Parthenon and other temples that crowned the Acropolis were built by workers who absorbed lead dust with every breath and drank water contaminated by the very building materials they used in their construction. The sculptures and paintings that decorated these magnificent structures were created by artists whose enhanced visual perception may have been the result of heavy metal damage to their optic nerves and visual cortex. The decline and fall of ancient Greek civilization takes on new meaning when viewed as the culmination of centuries of systematic self-poisoning by an entire culture. The political fragmentation that weakened the Greek city-states, the economic difficulties that reduced their prosperity, the military defeats that ended their independence, all may have been partly the result of the cumulative effects of chemical contamination on the cognitive abilities and physical health of the population. As the toxic burden accumulated over generations, the intellectual vigor and cultural creativity that had made Greek civilization great gradually gave way to the confusion, weakness, and decline that marked its eventual absorption into the Roman Empire. The legacy of ancient Greek drinking culture extends far beyond the boundaries of the classical world to influence the development of European civilization for centuries to come. The Romans inherited not only Greek art, literature, and philosophy, but also many of their toxic practices, particularly the use of lead in wine production and water distribution systems. The monastery system of medieval Europe preserved classical knowledge while also maintaining traditions of herbal medicine and alcoholic beverage production that continued many of the same dangerous practices that had characterized ancient Greek culture. The modern world has largely eliminated the specific sources of contamination that plagued ancient Greek society, but we continue to face similar challenges in our relationship with chemical substances that promise pleasure or enhancement while delivering hidden costs in terms of human health and environmental damage. The story of ancient Greek drinking culture serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing immediate gratification without understanding the long-term consequences of our actions, and about the ways in which entire civilizations can become complicit in their own destruction through practices that seem harmless or even beneficial on the surface. As we reflect on this long journey through the dangerous drinking culture of ancient Greece, we can appreciate both the tragic irony of a civilization that achieved greatness while systematically destroying itself, in the profound human capacity for creating beauty, wisdom, and meaning even under conditions of severe chemical stress and neurological impairment. The story of Mnesikles and the countless other victims of ancient toxicological practices reminds us that the line between enhancement and destruction, between pleasure and poison, is often thinner than we imagine, and that the price of ignorance about the substances we consume can be measured, not just in individual lives, but in the fate of entire civilizations.